Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. Adrian Freese and Trey Bailey invite you to join them on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, as we participate in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education.
Today, we have some very special guests on, good friends of mine, Ben Lyda and his daughter, Eden. And this is going to be a really exciting episode for a lot of reasons. Bringing Shakespeare into our schools is really important. And Ben has done it very well and has a lot of experience making Shakespeare very approachable and fun, and has awakened the art of drama in many students that I know, that I even have connections with. And so I wanted to have him and his daughter Eden on the program. I was recently speaking with Eden, and her excitement and enthusiasm as a teenager for Shakespeare and drama is very contagious. And I know that you will be blessed today when you hear her stories as well. We're going to start off with Ben, and I'd like him to tell a little bit of his background, and then we'll jump straight into the list of questions I've got.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm so happy to be here, and congratulations on launching your new website and podcast.
Thanks.
I started in education some 20 years ago in public school, and after several years of doing that, I realized that my philosophy of education just was not in accord with what we were doing in public schools. Of course, I knew that, but it gets to a point where you just can't do it anymore. And so I ended up going to Ambleside School in Fredericksburg. I was blown away by what they were doing because they put into practice a lot of theories and made them work. And I saw a living education happening right here in Texas, in Fredericksburg, which was exactly the kind of education I wanted to bring back to my hometown of Denton, where we opened a school, Charlotte Mason inspired school there called St. George School, and ran that for a few years. Unfortunately, it was a casualty of the economy and COVID, and it couldn't continue. So now I'm teaching in Fort Worth at a large classical school. Now, as far as Shakespeare goes, though, there's a deeper story. We actually, I should say myself, I was in a faculty meeting in a large ISD in North Texas, and one day the curriculum director for this ISD asked this department question. She said, "Do we really need Julius Caesar anymore in the high school curriculum?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my
Yeah,
jaw dropped.
right.
And I don't remember what I started saying because I was so shocked by the idea of dropping Shakespeare in a high school curriculum. And this is arguably, by state standards, one of the better school districts in the state. And I started saying something, who knows what. And she said to me, "Don't give me your philosophy. Give me something I can tell the board," which is exactly what she said. And so
Wow.
I dropped the buzzword, which is college readiness. And so I said, "Well, college readiness." And she said, "Okay." So I saved Shakespeare that day for who knows how long. But since then, I felt this slipping away of many classics, but especially Shakespeare, which is bedrock to language in the English language. And I wanted to do something about it. I don't even know at the time if I could express why Shakespeare was important. I just instinctively knew it was. Well, we were also homeschooling at the time, and we decided, my wife and I, that this is actually something we could provide for homeschoolers in our community, an experience of Shakespeare. So not just a dry, dead reading in like you tend to get in high school, but an actual experience of Shakespeare, where children as young as 9 years old can come and experience Shakespeare for themselves and begin to love Shakespeare. And so I started the Children's Shakespeare Academy, in which we produced full productions of Shakespeare plays. I abridged them a bit for parts that were very antiquated or obscure. Occasionally, as you know, Shakespeare for content. but generally they were doing the entire production of various Shakespeare plays. Children as young as 9. And this was another big important part for me, and this comes from another experience. I have my own children, and we took them to Shakespeare in the Park in Dallas when my oldest were about maybe 6 and 8, I think. And I just remember very clearly there was a couple sitting on their blanket in front of us, turned around and said, "So did you bring a iPad for them?" Ha 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 ha.
Oh, wow. It's just like the culture, the mindset we're in is so sad.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So I said, "No, they're going to watch the play," and they did. Now I know the 6-year-old, and Eden was one of them. She was the 6-year-old, the 6-year-old, and the 8-year-old. Yeah, I know they didn't understand every word. It was A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I remember them laughing their heads off. I remember them being so enchanted and enjoying the show. Do you
And you
remember
don't
that?
and
Yeah,
you
no,
actually yeah, and you don't want them to understand everything, especially the stuff that's, a little mature. You
Well,
kind of want that to go over their heads, right?
well, yeah. I mean, it's a fallacy to think that they have to understand every word in order to understand, and in
Right.
order to have the experience that's necessary to develop that relationship with the content.
Mhm.
I think that Charlotte Mason said this best when she said, "It's not about how much they know, but how much they care."
Mhm.
So, what's that?
we say that quote in our Enchiridion at school.
It's an excellent quote and very important because as we educate children to think they have to understand every word before we present the ideas to them, we're really just we're not feeding them well enough. We're not feeding them well enough with all the richness of language when we're talking about literature. So in short, we started the Children's Shakespeare Company with children as young as 9, as old as 18. And the first play we did is, guess what? Julius Caesar.
Wow, that's a pretty big one too.
Yeah, it was. And there's a lot of practical aspects about the choices I make for shows. For an example, although there's a huge cast in Julius Caesar, it's a script that's really easy to combine roles. There's I don't know, probably 15 different senator characters, but you just make them into one senator and they can do a lot of the job. And so you have to take in consideration how big your cast is and which show you're going to do. Generally, if you have 12 actors, any Shakespeare show can be done, although you might have to either combine characters or have actors play more than one part. But he worked with a ready cast, and so he was always writing plays with a certain number of people in mind. So 12 is a pretty safe number. 16 is probably better. We started, probably our first show maybe had 11. So we combined a few parts and I cut a few parts, things like that. Sometimes you have to make those necessary arrangements. The production was so low. It was kids bringing their capes and dress up from home. And it was packed into our little hall in our church. And the stage was like a 3x4 platform with a rug on it. But it only took a few years, and it caught on very quickly. And sure enough, the children as young as 9 began to love Shakespeare, and they came back and they came back and they came back. And so it grew to the point where we were able to rent the theater on the square in Denton and have, I think we had 2 performances. We probably had over 200 people attending in those shows. We had professional lighting. We had costumes made by hand. It was a beautiful production. And that was probably the highlight of the Children's Shakespeare Academy.
Oh, I love it. So I know that you put some fun twists on your productions, and I've enjoyed seeing a few of them. And I'd like to hear you talk about like what some of those twists are and why you did that.
Well, a fun thing about Shakespeare is because he's so universal in understanding what it means to be human and what that human experience is, that you really can, as I've seen in films before, you really can change the setting without completely changing the story. So I do like to have a lot of fun, and I try to bring the students something different every time, something they haven't done before with Shakespeare. So a more recent example is just this last summer. We put on The Tempest, which that story, if you aren't familiar with that story, there's a island and there are exiles on there, Prospero and his daughter, and there's some strange kind of magical creatures on the island, and then another ship who happens to be his enemies who sent him there in the first place. In a storm, they crash on that island, and there's all kinds of adventures that take place. So I thought, well, what if we put this on a planet in outer space, and let's just say a spaceship crashed, and all those little magical creatures are various aliens. And so this last summer, we put The Tempest into a 1960s B movie where Prospero looked a little bit like David Bowie, and Ariel was a robot, complete with dryer vent legs, So
Oh, that is so fun. The one I saw, the Taming of the Shrew, which was Texas. Tell a little bit about that one.
yeah, I thought the Texas theme, the kind of old West theme for Taming the Shrew, was very appropriate. Besides, there's a couple of random lines like something about rope tricks and things like that. If you're familiar with that story, I know you are, but for some of your listeners out there, in that story, there's a shrew, which is an ill-tempered woman who would actually use violence against her sister. She was untamed, which is the language of the play, a very bad person you wouldn't want to marry off. But in those days, the older sister had to be married first. She was the oldest sister. So the whole story is like, we got to get Kate married off, but nobody wants to marry her before her younger sister Bianca can actually move forward with her life. And so in comes Petruchio, who decides, I'm going to tame the shrew. Okay, well, there's some machismo thing going on there. It had to be appropriate. And I thought, well, okay, the Old West, you kind of have that culture going on. It seemed to work. And I felt like at the end of the day, it did. So we had saddles, and we had lassos, and we had cowboys. And at the end of the day, if you were watching Oklahoma or our westernized version of A Taming of the Shrew, I think you'd probably see a little congruence.
Yeah, it was great fun. It was great fun. I really love that you do that. I think it's a neat idea. The kids seem to love it, and I think it's enjoyable for the audience. Um, it was really fun for me to see the Taming of the Shrew set in Texas. It was like, oh, what a neat idea! It worked. It worked great, and you didn't even have to compromise the lines to do it.
No,
But
no,
you brought in kind of the music style was Texan, and it was hilarious, and I loved that you did it outside and you utilized the big trees, and the kids were climbing the trees and jumping off the tree. It was hilarious. It was so good.
Oh, and you're such a great audience member. You were laughing louder, I think, than anybody else out there. You had such a good time that night.
It
And
was
I think it was about 30 degrees too, but we had
Oh
about
yeah, it
100 people
was.
come out.
But you were selling hot chocolate, and
Yeah.
it was great.
And
It
we
was
lit a
so fun.
fire pit and just kind of kept everybody as cozy as we could, and
It
everybody had a great
was
time.
it was so fun. You hooked me at that moment. And then I saw the Midsummer Night's Dream, and I still have tons of little clips of videos on my iPhone from that. And Eden, you just did amazing. I want to bring you into this now. So Eden, watching you in Midsummer Night's Dream, clearly you love what you're doing. I mean, it was so obvious that you have been brought up very well with Shakespeare and that you enjoy it. So I'd like to hear more of your story, and like, how old were you when you started performing, and what was your favorite role? And we'll get into some more questions.
Shakespeare has always been a point of anticipation for me because when my dad started the program, I was too little to join, and so when my brother joined, I was like, it was my goal to like also do like what my older brother was doing. And so once I was able to start, it was really exciting. I was about 9 when I started. I like literally like just turned 9 like the week of my first rehearsal, and so it was really exciting. And
What was your first role?
my first role was in we did Macbeth in like a Scottish style, which was really fun. And I had 2 like minor roles in that. I was a gentlewoman, Lady Macbeth's gentlewoman, and I was Macbeth's servant. And that was pretty fun. Um, And then back to the Taming of the Shrew, that was, I think, my first big role. And that one I really enjoyed. I think I was in like 5th grade when I did that. And I was the Shrew. And that one I think is one of my favorite ones because at the end of like the play, spoiler, she gets tamed, the Shrew, and she has like this whole speech talking to her sister and I think this widow who turns out that they were also shrews by being disobedient to their husbands because their husbands had been betting on like, oh, let's see whose wife is the most obedient, and Petruchio was like, oh, mine is totally, and they're like, haha, she's not. But then she does come, and I love the speech that she does about like respecting your husband, and that's definitely been like that was definitely a turning point because it made me really kind of think about like not only like what it would be like if I became a wife, but also like how well my mother does it as a wife. Like,
Wow, that's beautiful. I remember that speech, and it's a beautiful speech. I agree. Actually, the first time I ever read the speech, it really touched me deeply too. It is a really great speech. Do you remember any of it or any lines from anything?
yes, I do remember a couple.
Do you want to
You want me
share?
to?
Do you want to? Yeah, I'd
Okay.
love go into character for
I
a
don't
second
remember
here
the whole
on
thing,
the
but
spot, whatever you want.
all right. It starts off, fie, unknit that threatening, unkind brow, and dart not scornful glances from thine eyes to wound thy lord, thy king, thy governor. It blots thy beauty as frost do bite the meads, confounds thy fame as whirlwind shakes fair blood, buds, and in no sense is meet or amiable. And then
And how many years ago did you memorize that?
That was
like 5 years ago?
No, it was more like
ago.
3 years ago.
Oh, I feel like it was 4 or 5 because this was way before COVID.
Yeah, I was in 5th grade, so
Yeah.
it was 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost
Yeah.
4 years.
You're great. So what I want to know a little bit more about how your experience with your dad has helped to shape you and given you a passion for drama. And how has it influenced you? I know you mentioned you're creating a script for The Princess Bride, so we want to get into that as well. But go ahead and share some of your thoughts.
I've really enjoyed working with my dad. I think it's definitely like made my relationship with my father a lot closer. It has its challenges too, because sometimes if I'm misbehaving, I feel like I'm getting picked on, but I mean, I deserve that probably. But
You don't misbehave very much.
yeah, that's true. The couple times that I have. And I think my dad is one of the most amazing people on the earth that I've ever met. And I really loved his the way he saw literature, and Shakespeare had definitely like grew my perception about things. Like the language has made it a lot easier for me to understand like older literature works. Like I've been reading Ivanhoe for fun, and I think because of my Shakespeare knowledge, I've been able to understand it, and I can like laugh, and it's funny, and I get the jokes. And so
you're how old? You're how old?
14.
Yeah, no, that's pretty major. Ivanhoe's tough.
Well, I get Dad to read it sometimes because the beginning is a little boring, but
Yeah, but you're understanding it. That's a big deal.
yes, and I think that has a lot to do with the Shakespeare that I got to do for a lot. And I've just really enjoyed it because I've always been like an average reader, but acting, and so I always felt like when I read, I was able to like slip away for a while. But then acting, I feel like I literally am somewhere else. And it's really fun to feel like what it's like to be in the character's shoes, literally almost. And so I feel I feel like when I do the plays, I understand them a lot more than when I just read them, because I've read a couple plays, and it's a lot more kind of drab and sad, and I really enjoy doing them, and I feel like there's a lot more value in performing them because it makes you see it happen before your eyes, and it also has a lot to do with teamwork though too, because it makes you realize how much you depend on the other actors as well, and how much they depend on you, because there's been times when we're like getting close to the production and you start freaking out because you're like, are we gonna pull through? Is this gonna, are we gonna make it? And it's I guess really taught me that just teamwork and like encouragement and doing scary things, because standing up in front of people and trying to put on a show is scary. I always get nervous like 5 minutes before the show. I'm like, oh my goodness.
That's good.
And like there's no perfect show, but the audience don't know that if you make mistakes, and it's really worth it at the end when you finish the play and they applaud, and it just makes everything worthwhile. All that panicking and trying to memorize your lines in time. It really is like, yeah, I don't know, it's great.
Tell me about your project on the Princess Bride and how that's going. Tell our listeners how that you were sharing your story with me, and I want to hear again for our audience.
So for the Princess Bride, my dad had been doing productions for the school I'm going to right now. And he wasn't going to do one in the spring. And so me and my friends were like, oh, that's sad, because we really enjoyed it. The one we did in the summer, and the one that we had literally just finished the one in the fall. We'd finished, I think, Much Ado About Nothing. And we were kind of joking. And one of the girls I was with was like, oh, we could do our own thing. We could do the Princess Bride. And we were joking totally at first. But then I think one of the teachers found out, and then it was kind of like, well, why not? I mean, I've done tons of plays before, and I'm not that terrible at writing, and neither is the girl that I'm working with. And so we got it approved by the headmaster, and then it just kind of moved on from there. And a couple times we've looked at each other and like, what are we doing? But I think it's also really helped though, because I've worked with my dad so many times. I know that even if it feels like it's going to fall through, I always have that support, and I know my dad's going to support me in almost everything I do. So that's also been a huge motivation.
Have you written the script? Have you finished it?
Oh, we're working on it. I'm writing it with a friend of mine, and we've like split up the acts and the scenes, and like, you write this scene, I'll write this scene. And we were trying to finish it by the end of this spring break. We had our first editions on last Monday, and there was a couple people out, so I think we might have to do a couple like redo editions, just to like make sure we're casting okay. But we're trying to finish the script this week.
Are you going to be Buttercup?
No, I'm not.
You would be perfect as Buttercup, though. So are you going to be in it, or just directing, or both?
Originally I was just gonna be like helping directing and like setting and costumes, but we don't have enough like actors, because there are kind of a lot of parts, and a lot of them aren't even that major, but just the way we wrote it, it's kind of like, we need this character. So I think I am probably gonna get like 2 parts, and I think I know what they are, but we haven't fully casted yet, so I'm still not entirely sure.
This is wonderful. And are you going to be doing this at your school?
Yes.
Okay. Unless we get a lot of people from our audience that, want to buy 100 tickets, we might have to find another venue. Because I want to come see this. This is going to be awesome. Written by a student, for students. That's just amazing. And everybody loves The Princess Bride. I mean, who doesn't love that? It's just such a great story.
Yeah. And it's almost entirely student, like, organized. We have a couple teachers who are like supervising and kind of helping us like brainstorm ideas, but it's mostly just like the me and four other girls who are doing this, and then the kids who want to hop on with the ride and help us actually perform it. So
That's exciting. Very exciting. What, Eden, from your experience, what would you say to a homeschool mom or a teacher who is afraid of reading Shakespeare to little children?
uh I don't think there is a I don't think there is a need to be afraid. I mean, there are some things in Shakespeare that are a little bit like not appropriate for little children. And so I mean, there's tons of like edited versions of the stories that you can get that you can read to them, like just as like books or stories. Because I have read some of those. They're not like a script, but it's like a story, and those are enjoyable. And I mean, it's not the same as like actually like
Mhm.
performing it, but it definitely does like help you get an overview of like the culture that Shakespeare lived in and how he saw the world and just like life in
Yeah.
general. It it really is something very just wonderful. I think
Mhm.
classics are really interesting, and it's something that our culture has kind of lost
Yeah.
in these like modern years. They're not People are focusing in more material things, and Shakespeare really does touch a lot on the spiritual. He's very aware of that, especially like in Macbeth. He has ghosts show up,
Mhm.
and Hamlet, and it's like there is a spiritual world, and our modern world tries to tell us it doesn't exist, and it does.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I
And
think Shakespeare's does that very well of like kind of throwing that out there and still telling a really good story.
right. Ben, I know that you read Shakespeare stories to Eden when she was before she was 9, before she was in the programs. What can you tell our listeners what versions you recommend to read to children for classroom teachers and for homeschoolers?
Well, I'm afraid it's been too long for me to tell you which kind of prose version I like the best. But yeah, we read a few prose versions to them. Usually before they saw something with us, we would read those. I would always advise when possible to try to see the show even before reading. Well, then again, it's nice to actually read it if you know you're about to see it to kind of give them a heads up about what they're going to see. But just reading alone, when possible, I'd always encourage the show itself because Shakespeare intended his shows to be seen and performed and experienced, not just read.
Mhm.
Of course, we could always read them. When the kids get old enough, I'd recommend just reading the script together, assigning parts at the dinner table, and you could read
Sure.
around like that. I know some families who've done that with kids about the same age as mine.
Now, do you have any opinions on like there's the Edith Nesbit stories, beautiful stories of Shakespeare. There's the Marion Charles Lamb, and then Bruce Covell. I like the Bruce Covell picture books quite a bit. I think I might have experienced my first one when I visited your school. What are your thoughts on those different versions?
Yeah, I had forgotten his name, but yes, the those picture books I quite like. I would
Bruce
say that those
Covell.
are my favorite. Well, yeah, those are
Yeah.
also my favorite.
Hmm.
I like them because of the pictures, because the names can be tricky. It kind of helps the children kind of identify with a particular person in a particular place, which a script, of course, doesn't give you all of that necessarily, like a novel would. So having those pictures are useful. And in addition, he would fill in a lot of the background story. I think the Nesbit and the Lamb stories is sometimes abridged so much it was harder to follow. Where he
Hmm.
will expand upon the story. Of course, it's shorter, but he'll expand upon details of the story so that kind of makes sense when you take it out of the kind of theatrical context.
And his books are illustrated beautifully.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, beautiful. I personally, when I was homeschooling, I used both the Nesbit and the Marion Charles Lamb one, and I liked the Lamb better because I felt like my children could narrate it better. The Nesbit one was really tough to get narrations out of, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know if there was just too much disconnect within the story, the flow was maybe disrupted so that it was harder for the kids to narrate? What are your thoughts? Did you try either of those?
Yeah, and again, I don't remember which one it was. It must have been Nesbit because there was a similar experience where one of those authors, I think, abridged it so much that you just couldn't really get into the meat of who these characters were.
Yeah, I
It's
think it
felt
was
more
the
like a
Nesbit.
summary.
Yeah,
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 so I agree.
yeah, yeah.
But I think your test is a perfect test, especially if you're homeschooling, to narrate. If your kids aren't able to narrate something, then maybe it's time to take a step back and either find a different version or just try something different.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And even Charlotte Mason says if you're reading a story to the kids, then they're not connecting and they're not able to narrate, put it away for a while, or maybe it's not the right book for them. And some people get, really kind of bent out of shape thinking, well, I have to read this book. And well, no, you don't. There's a
Mhm.
lot of books. There's a lot of really good books. You can pick up a different one.
That's
But
right.
I think the Covell one really does seem to lend itself well to really good narrations, and it's beautiful. So anyhow, yeah. And I know it's out
Yeah, I
of
agree.
print, but I think I'd like to reach out to Bruce Coville and ask him if he can get his publishers to reprint it. He does have, I think, 5 of his stories that are available on Audible. So he's reading them,
Oh,
but
that's excellent. I didn't
which
know
is
that.
great. But
Yeah,
it's still not the same as having the picture book in your hand, especially because the illustrations are so well done.
they are.
So um let's see. Um what do you, Ben, say to parents who are maybe taken aback by Shakespeare and feel like it's too hard for kids or it's too broady? What do you say to those parents?
Yeah, so there's two questions there, and the first I'll address is the content. There is Shakespeare content you don't want to bring to a child. You're not going to bring little children Macbeth. However, we did do the play with children as young as 9. There's just some content, of course, that I would never do. For example, Othello.
Hmm.
In that story, the man is made to become uh, through lies jealous of his wife, and he ends up murdering his wife. So I would never in a million years do that with children.
Hmm.
So there's some you just won't do. But then there's other stories that are very simple, like The Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream, which is about tension and reconciliation and forgiveness. And those are wonderful stories to start with. I am a little more careful when it comes to the tragedies because the content tends to be a little heavier. So we did Macbeth with a heavy Scottish theme, and we've done what other tragedy did we do?
We started Romeo and Juliet.
Oh yeah, well we were going to do a Romeo and Juliet, but then COVID hit, so that one was shut down. And I had put off that one for many years as well. So I'm very careful with the tragedies because the content. But the fact is that most of that kind of content will go over the children's heads, either with the language or just because the way it's put, it's just they're not going to pick up on it. But on the other hand, um, I would endorse fairy tales. And if you read the original fairy tales, there's all kinds of content that some people are a little squeamish about with little children. And I think this is kind of a fallacy. The truth is that children are very aware of good and evil. They know that there are dragons in the world.
Hmm.
And for us to not address those things and sweep it under the rug and pretend like it's not there, I don't think is doing a service. What we find in fairy tales and in good literature like Shakespeare is we acknowledge the dragons in the world, we acknowledge the evil in the world, but we show how do we get through this? How do we navigate through this?
Hmm.
How do we succeed? Where does justice come in? They'll celebrate when the wicked witch has to walk on hot irons because they know justice has been done. It's we adults who have a problem with justice because we have such a record of sins. We're like, no, not me. But children in innocence recognize that justice is good and that it must occur. And so when we want to train our children acquiring virtue, well, part of that is, hey, how do we slug through these bad people in these stories?
Hmm.
How do we get through that? And with Shakespeare, you'll often find there's forgiveness, there's love, there's friendship. There's all kinds of ways that these characters navigate through hard times. And this is a gift that we can give our children.
I love that. Speaking of virtue, I did want to go that direction. One of the concerns I have in some classical schools that I've worked with is that teachers tend to think, they have a mindset of, you have to have comprehension questions and you have to have direct instruction in virtue. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how Shakespeare allows, well, literature, even in general, a natural way of virtue being instilled and
Hmm.
guiding them rather than giving them direct instruction or pointing it out. What's been your experience with, um, applying kind of the methods of Charlotte Mason that are a lot less direct instruction? Not that there's anything wrong with direct instruction,
Right.
but how do you bring out the conversations of virtue from the children and what they've gleaned from it without like giving them a sermon on the virtue that's in the story? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah. How
absolutely.
do you do that? I want our teachers to kind of glean from your wisdom and experience.
Yeah, well, you can't learn virtue from a definition. That's not the way humans are wired. We learn virtue through modeling. And so that's when literature becomes very important if you pick the right literature, because we see models of virtue. That's what children recognize and can aspire to. They understand things very concretely, not in the abstract. And so to have kind of discussion guide questions and definitions and talk about it a virtue in the abstract. Um, Again, I'm not going to say don't do that. I'm not going to say it's valueless, but it won't capture their hearts. And
Mm,
virtue is a matter of the heart. So stories capture the heart. Stories are the best way that we can teach virtue outside of living virtuous lives ourselves. The scripture offers that to us, and great literature offers that to us, and of course, I would advocate that Shakespeare does too.
mm-hmm. Are there any kind of questions that you ask the students when they're like when you read the story and they narrate? Do they automatically bring up the virtues they noticed, or do you ask any kind of questions like what virtues did you notice? I mean, how do you do that? What has been your experience?
Well, I can't say I've been consistent with asking the casts reflective questions, although I have a few times. For an example, when kids are very candid, I asked my cast from Macbeth, what did we learn? Because it was a tragedy, so I'm being a little more careful about it. And I said, so what did we learn from this? And the first kid raised his hand and said, never listen to your wife. I thought, wait a minute. Okay, well, so they're paying attention. But the conversation continued. And, the thrust of that conversation was about temptation and resisting temptation.
Mhm,
Because we even had a physical object in that story to help bring home that point. Is we had an apple that was brought into the scene several times, and Macbeth would look at the apple, and it was of course symbolic of this temptation. And I can't remember. I think it was his wife who was encouraging him to do this heinous crime, this murder, and she hands him the apple and he takes it. So it's very clear what we're trying to do on the set. And again, this is one of the reasons why, with a good directed show, they're going to get a lot more out of it if you do it right on the stage, than just reading it cold. And so at the end of the play, though, Macbeth throws the apple in frustration and anger. So even through that action, we are able to kind of tell the story. So the kids understood that. And
mhm,
again, they get excited about the story. They know it's hard. Everything Eden said about the teamwork and the
mhm.
challenge and the language, all of that comes to a head in the performance. And so it's not just that we're going to have had an abstract conversation about it, but that's going to stay with them the rest of their life. And when you have something as powerful as the image of our apple, and understanding about, the deception of temptation, I mean, that's a lifelong lesson right there.
Mhm.
And it doesn't require a lot of nagging, and it doesn't require guideline questions, but the
Right.
lessons learned.
Yeah, you didn't have to say to the students, okay, so this apple is symbolic of, and you just knew that they were getting it.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
We
great.
we we take for granted, I think, that children can't understand something. They understand, I think, a lot more than we give them credit for.
That's true. That's true. So, Ben, what advice can you give to schools that do not have a drama program? Where could they start? What resources would you recommend? And I would love to have you be part of our consulting team with headmasters, possibly do some professional development online for classroom teachers for drama. tell us where our teachers and our headmasters can go from here.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, yeah, that sounds wonderful. I would love to have that opportunity. Um, well, I think that the simplest thing, if you're just starting out, and if you don't have, I didn't mention this earlier, I did have a theater background in college a bit. Um, Actually, I stopped the theater major because I said, well, I'll never make a living with theater, but well, here I am. But in any case, I think it's really simple to start. If you have no experience and nobody on your staff, or if it's just a homeschool situation, you can always start by Reader's Theater. Reader's Theater is a great way to get started because it's fun, because you start breaking the characters into parts, which helps with the visible part, because sometimes those names can get confusing. And it doesn't require money. It doesn't require a lot of setup. So I would say the first step is a Reader's Theater, reading through plays aloud with characters.
Reader's Theater, we'll put a link in the show notes for that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And then, you can move on from there. It's really simple to just, it doesn't have to be a huge production. We've done productions outside, as you mentioned. Sometimes the natural surroundings were our setting. I think your play that you're doing this summer.
Yeah, we're gonna do outside in the front of the school.
Because there's a nice wall, there's vines, there's trees, so it has
there's
everything you need for the set.
Right.
And do you have enough seating for 1,000 people if we get a lot of podcast listeners that want to drive down?
If we get 1,000 people, then we build the amphitheater.
Right, that's true. When is it going to be?
It's gonna be, I think, this June at the very beginning. And it's either the 10th or 11th.
Okay.
And since we are doing it at the school, we do have some flexibility with the schedule, which is kind of nice. And I think we're still trying to find a set date, because since we've like kind of pulled it through the summer, there has been a little bit of like people who want to do the thing can't do it because summer stuff.
Yeah.
So that has posed a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's definitely going to be around those two dates for sure.
Well, if any of our local DFW listeners are interested, they can email me and I'll give them the date once you have it set.
Right.
Okay, so Ben, you were saying about the natural setting. Any other thoughts about getting started?
Yeah, another simple thing to do is use a local church. There's lots of churches that have stages that are willing to help. I know a lot of little groups around in this area have done that as well. And then, we rented the theater at a certain point, which there was a great deal there. That's actually getting harder and harder and more expensive. But there's lots of creative ways, again, for in churches or auditoriums or outside to stage in. Costumes, of course. Again, you can have a lot of fun with this by setting the scene in a different era. It doesn't have to be of the Renaissance era. It doesn't have to be the Middle Ages if you do Hamlet. It could be modern era. Shakespeare himself actually had his actors wearing modern clothing. Whatever was in fashion in his day is what they were wearing. And people could understand, though, through the language and through imagination, where they were supposed to be. That's the audience participation, the part that they have to play in the whole production. So there's lots of inexpensive ways to get started that way. There's ways to abridge the script yourself. I think I might be making some scripts available that I've already abridged to kind of cut it down for everybody if that's a need out there. I would love to help with it.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think that's going to be a need. So we usually close our podcast with a question, and I've changed the questions up a little bit for you guys. So both of you, I would like the answer from both of you. You can answer one of two questions. What is a quote from a book or a play that has had a huge impact on you? Or what role in a play has had the most profound effect on you and why?
Okay. Well, one of my favorite lines from the Odyssey, I'll tell you this. He's on Circe's island, and he's been there for many years, kind of a captive. He's a captive of paradise. Circe has offered him eternal life, paradise on earth, all the good things he could possibly imagine and want. But then the gods come down and send her a message. You've got to let him go. And so reluctantly, she says to him, okay, I have to let you go, but you could choose to stay. And remember, eternal life. I'm the most beautiful goddess. You're going to love being here. All the food you can eat. You could choose that. Or if you leave, you're going to suffer. And Odysseus says, even if some God beats me upon the waves, I'm going home. Let this adventure follow. I love those words. They're Christian words as well. They're better as a Christian, though, because we know we have a good Father who will help us through those trying times to get us where we need to go. And it should encourage all of us to try something hard.
That's good. That's lovely, Ben. Eden, how about you?
I don't have such a great quote as that, but I guess it was the Taming of the Shrew that I've already talked about. That one was definitely something that had a huge impact on me. Yeah, I think that one's it.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. This is going to be a real blessing to our listeners. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening. We invite you to experience the art of teaching through interactive learning communities at our Patreon page. Visit patreon.com/classical education. Also, be sure to join the conversation on our Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/classical education. We are a listener supported podcast, so your support makes this podcast possible. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once wrote, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be, in a few words, this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know, best of all, what it is to behave under it, as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."